a little panoramic view of some woodlands, and we can make a start. Ciao and welcome. I thought that as I'm not videoing myself cook today, it might be a good idea to take you outside with me for a change and make this video while I walk. And I think it's a great opportunity for you to appreciate a little bit where we live. Also, you can keep me some company. So let's make a start and talk about coffee. Many of us drink coffee, and some of us might have 1 cup a day, but also some of us might have several cups a day. It is also fair to say that for many of us, myself included actually, a cup of coffee is the very first drink we have in the morning. But actually I have a latte. But I have to be honest, and it's not until actually I start looking into more deeply, I don't think a lot of us actually really realize what coffee is. In my last video I showed you how I make my perfect cup of coffee using a moka pot, the Bialetti moka pot. And as I ended that video, I asked you if you wanted me to cover a little bit more about coffee, and to my delight, a lot of you said yes. So rather than explicitly answering those questions today and telling you about the grind size and the best coffee in the world or the worst coffee in the world, if there is such a thing, I thought actually it might be a good idea to just press the pause button for a moment and to step back and talk a little bit about coffee first, to see what it is, where it comes from, and how actually it has become such an important thing to have in our daily lives. The first thing that actually I find quite interesting and fascinating is the word itself. If you think about it, it sounds very similar in most languages. You got coffee, café, café, sometimes it's spelled with a K, and generally always you recognize the word whenever you hear it. And that in itself actually demonstrates that it is not something which has just traveled as a product, it's also something that has traveled with people and with languages and habits. Most historians agree that the word originates from an Arabic word that is spelled Qahwa, and phonetically is spelled something like Kua, and then it translated into Turkish, and through Turkish into the rest of Europe, and the word stays similarly to coffee. The discovery of coffee itself is quite interesting. It's not the case that one day somebody woke up and thought, oh, I feel like inventing coffee this morning. Actually, the most reliable story goes back to the 9th century in Ethiopia, where a goat herder, somebody called Kaldi, he noticed that some of his goats, who had been eating some red cherry lookalike fruits from a bush, were behaving differently to the rest. They were happier, they were more dynamic, more alerted, and also he spotted that they did struggle to sleep, regardless of how many bedtime stories he was telling them. Now, I'm not sure if that story is true or not, but it actually kind of demonstrates how in history of humankind, evolution and so on, we spot trends, we spot patterns, and we learn from those things, and that is very likely to be the way coffee was actually discovered. And long before it became a drink, people in East Africa were already using coffee plants in a very simple way. I think I'm gonna sit here. I'm struggling to talk and walk at the same time properly. It is very likely that they used to chew the cherries, also crush the seeds and mix with some fat as energy food. So back then, coffee wasn't a thing of pleasure, it was very functional. They realized that gave them energies, but also they could stay awake for longer and travel some distance. And to travel some distance is exactly what I had to do. Shortly after I sat down, it started to rain and it got progressively hard. I was about a couple of miles away from home, so by the time I got home, I was absolutely drenched. Anyway, I just had a warming shower and I made myself not a cup of coffee, I made myself a cup of tea, a warming cup of tea, and I'm ready to continue. But at the very least, we are back into familiar surroundings, of course. So much later, coffee began to change, and by around the 15th century in the Arab world, people started to dry the seeds, to roast them, to grind them, and to mix them with hot water. And that was a crucial moment, as up until then coffee had been functional, but all of a sudden it became something different, aromatic, and something which was enjoyable and to share socially. And this is when coffee houses started to appear, where people gathered to talk, to listen, to speak, to read. It became a social event. So coffee was never a drink, was a reason to socialize and stay together. Now let's talk about coffee itself for a moment, as it actually doesn't start as a bean. There's a plant, and the plant has got some beautiful big vibrant green leaves, and these plants, they produce fruits, and the fruits are very similar to very bright red cherries. And inside each cherry there are the coffee seeds, and generally there are a couple of seeds per cherry. And if you were to open one of those cherries, the seeds are fairly clear in color. It's only after they have been dried and roasted that they turn into a color very similar to chocolate, if you like. And then once it's ground, becomes the powder that we are used to see when we make our espresso or whatever coffee you might be using at home. But coffee is very peculiar as to where it grows. It needs warmth, but not burning heat. Also, it needs sunlight, but not burning sun, and it needs rainfall, but not a downpour. Also, coffee grows best at altitude. So actually, the areas around the equator, which often are referred to as the coffee belt, is where coffee grows really well. And you will find that often you hear places such as zones of Asia, where coffee comes from, also Africa, and of course Central and South America. And because of those conditions, soil, altitude, rainfall, sunlight, coffee will taste differently depending on where it comes from. A little bit like wine. The grapes will dictate the taste of the wine. So if the grapes come from an area where, for example, next to a volcano and the soil is really fertile, the likelihood is that the wine will have more body than the grapes which have been grown in an area which is really dry and away from a volcano, just to give you a very simple analogy. So the taste of the coffee will change. It's likely to be more acidic in certain areas, earthier in other areas, or softer in other areas. But it doesn't mean that certain coffee is better than other coffee. It just tastes different. And of course, like all things, taste is always subjective. What I also find interesting is how all coffee starts the same way, a seed inside a fruit. And from there, then we end up with a myriad of products. Here I've got a different selection of moka pots. And for that, you need this type of coffee that is almost powdery. But also you might have an espresso machine at home, in which case you might have some capsules or some other type of ways to make espresso. Then there is the granulated coffee, which you can just add to water or to milk, filter coffee, and so on. And that is why I do not really like ranking coffee, because an awful lot depends on its intended use, of course. Then there is the discussion about coffee. Is it good for you? Is it bad for you? When I was a child, I was always led to believe that coffee wasn't good for you. And mostly because it can be quite addictive, and the caffeine effect obviously not great, especially with children. And even nowadays, obviously, children are advised not to drink coffee for that very reason. However, latest studies demonstrate that a little coffee actually is quite good for you, and it helps prevent dementia. Also, it helps prevent Parkinson's and so on, which is all great. But like I always say, even when I cook food and so on, everything in moderation, because we know that it's got caffeine, and we know that caffeine keeps you awake. So of course, if you don't get a good night's sleep, all of those things are out of the window. So I think the benefits of coffee clearly are there because depending on the circumstances, but everything in moderation as always. But what I find really interesting about the discovery of coffee is that it was accidental and it was gradually implemented, if you think about it, over the years, beginning from the 9th century. And it is shared, and actually shared to me is very powerful, because if you think about the social implication of coffee, is a word that often is used when a couple of friends who haven't seen each other in a long time will say to one another, oh, let's go and have a coffee. Or you might say to somebody, oh, we must catch up over a cup of coffee. It's something that symbolizes a social event, if you see what I mean. And I think that is quite beautiful. And I also like that it was not invented in a laboratory. It wasn't engineered. It's the spark of curiosity that makes us human, of course. In the next few videos, I will start answering some of your questions. Which pot to use? Is Bialetti better than the French press? And what works best for this coffee or for that coffee and so on. But I wanted to start with the coffee first, because I think it's important, as everything else, start from that. The very next video though will be which coffee to use best in the moka pot, as this is where I started from. So hopefully you found this little introductory video interesting, and thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.